Well, hello, welcome to our Hobby Horse DIY channel. Hope you enjoy this. This is something I made for my granddaughter when she turned 2 years old. It's done very simple with a dark piece of wood. We used walnut. You could stain something. I used an oak dowel, and we found a silhouette on the internet of a horse head. We traced it on some paper, cut that paper out, and laid it down on top of the walnut to start. About all you need is the walnut, a dowel, and a mop head, and a little bit of rope for the reins a little bit later, you'll see. I laid this on the wood, and we used a white pencil. So you get this from a hobby store. You can get a white art pencil or a yellow art pencil. Works a whole lot better on these dark woods. Otherwise, you'll never see a gray pencil mark on this. Pencil's a lot nicer because you can sand it off very easily versus a pen or a marker. Don't use a marker because it tends to soak into the wood and you're stuck with it. You can exaggerate these curves. In fact, you want to exaggerate them. The more exaggerated it is, the more it will look like a horse. You might be more accurate doing it smooth, but in fact, your head, your eyes want to see the exaggerations, and it'll interpret it as a horse head later on. So you'll see that we do that in 3D as well when we start to sand this. I'm going to use some power tools that you may not have to your disposal. Don't let that dissuade you. There's a very easy way to do this with a coping saw that you can get for really, really cheap. Instead of the big bandsaw I use, and of course with a file and some rasps, you can do all the 3D shaping and smoothing very easily. So this is not a hard project at all. And you'll notice that actually I moved this horse head forward when I go to the bandsaw. I drew this on a second time, moved it forward a couple inches just so I could round that back off a little bit better. I decided by the time I put this oak dowel in there 2 inches that I probably need a little bit more of the back of the head to where that cotton mop head would go as the horse's mane. So you can see the second image there, it's moved forward a few inches. Safety first, as always, make sure you know how to use your equipment. Again, you could do this with a coping saw, and it just take a little bit more time, but that just means you put a little more love into it. So don't be discouraged if you don't have some of these tools that you see. I do this as a furniture maker. I do a lot of custom furniture work, so you'll see some things in here that may not be available to the average hobby guy. But I will encourage you that every one of my tools was paid for by a project. Meaning I do one or two of these things, sometimes a bigger piece of furniture or table, and I would use that to fund the next tool. In fact, I just did that now. I did some historic theater French doors and windows, and that bought me a great big new cabinet saw that I'm going to see show up in about 3 weeks. And of course, you do that for tax reasons too. You start doing this, you can write those off as expenses. So if you're doing this and you think you might want to do this a lot, man, I plan to retire doing this real soon, and I'll just do this full time and have fun the rest of my years. Again, just kind of going around the curves. We're doing this to rough out the material, although this bandsaw is pretty accurate. And so I'm getting very close to my curves. And while I do spend a lot of time on the sander later, you're going to see, that's mostly to put in some 3D shapes. So not only to smooth out the curve and the saw marks, but then I also curve the edges and kind of put some three-dimensional depth into this piece of walnut. If you don't have walnut, go ahead and use any material that you have, and then just stain it before you do the glue up. So that way you can get the color into it and get some dark contrast between the wood, or don't. Make it all one color, that's fine too. There's no reason that it has to be colors. I just happen to have walnut on hand, which is a privilege, I know, but every once in a while I'll do some large conference tables out of this, and I just happen to have a little bit on hand. Taking my time. If you ever work with a bandsaw like this, you'll see that what you do is you find a radius point and pivot around that point, not so much around the saw blade. You're using the saw blade as the outer edge of the radius. I might do a training video on that sometime, but there's our finished profile. Looks pretty good, and I think it might already start to look like a horse. Then get over here to the sander. Again, this is kind of a big sander. I've got I think it's a either 100 grit or maybe even an 80 grit belt. This is my bigger sander, and you'll see a hose there in the bottom left. It's sucking up the sawdust. But this is made for fast material removal. So I do use probably an 80 grit belt, I think, on there right now, and it does knock down those edges very quickly. You'll see right now I'm just turning the outside edge, but in a minute I'm going to turn it at an angle, and you'll see that I'm going to start to soften the edges and get rid of that 90-degree corner. And you could do a router and just round it off. Say put a ½ inch or 3/4 inch round over bit on there, but you'd lose the nostrils. Wait and see what we do with that in a minute. See, now here, that's where I'm going into this 3D. So I'm going to start cutting into the edges, which forces some of those curves to be more pronounced. So what I'm doing is I'm going to soften on the inside edge of the curves, which bumps out the outside, like the horse's jowls and the nostrils, hit the bridge of his nose, things like that. And so you'll see here as I round this off, I'm going to go some of it even fairly deep up the side. I'll put it very flat against that curve, and see right there, I'm pretty flat, and then I round over, and I'm just kind of getting the shape. So you see right there underneath my elbow how that wood has been pushed in, and you kind of see a jowl forming a little bit, the cheek of that horse. Just enough to give it an effect. And you can see what's coming, and you see here it's very quickly if you can get your hands on one of these. Sometimes here in El Paso, where I'm at, El Paso, Texas, we do have a woodworkers club, and I think $75 a year, and the guys get down there, and I donate a lot of my scrap material to them. They love to see a bunch of this walnut and maple and cherry show up around Christmas time, especially. I usually tend to go down there around November, early December, and take a truckload of wood to them and just say, here guys, tear it up. So here we're setting up the stick, the riding stick, and so kind of what angle do I want to put that in? I'm going to eyeball that. This isn't anything precise. Don't worry about measurements and put your tape measure away. No, this is going to get a tape measure. This is a 3/4 inch Forester bit, and that's a good high quality bit there right there. The reason to use that one is because it's got a very good edge on it, and it gives me a really sharp edge as it goes into the wood. However, mine are short. So then this is a carpenter's roughing bit, and so it's still a Forester bit, but I even wrote on the box, if you go back and look at that, I wrote on the box that they tend to do a lot of tear out. So after I start off with a higher quality Forester, then I go in there and increase the depth of the hole with a roughing bit. Here we're going to start laying out some parts. Now I've still got a ball that I'm going to do on the lathe for the end of this dowel. But here we're kind of getting an idea of how things might look, how we're going to lay it out. I'm going to have to cut a notch into the head. I'm going to embed that hair down into the back of the head. So right here I'm going to lay that out. It's going to be, I think I did a 3/8 inch notch. You want it to be a little bit bigger than the depth of the horsehair. So I'm using a double-sided or a 2-blade marking gauge, and so this I'm setting up the caliper in my right hand is going to get a 3/8 inch space between the two blades, and now I'm figuring out how I center those blades on the edge of the head. So if I put it on one side and the other, it's centered now. Notice where my hands are holding. I'm holding it by the wooden clamp, and that clamp does a lot of things for me. It gives me a flat, stable base on the table so that it's very safe, and then I can move that around the way I just did with showing you with my hands. It's clamped very hard onto that piece of walnut, so the walnut is not going anywhere, and that way I can clamp at that angle. If you try to do that with your hands alone, that would be very unsafe. Always clamp things down. So you can see there's my groove. I'm going to hog that out with a drill bit and a chisel in a minute and make room to put the cotton hair down into it. So again, we do the same thing on the table saw, or I'm sorry, on the drill press. And so we stabilize this thing with a clamp again. So I'm not trying to hold that thing vertical. That would be dangerous. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to hog out everywhere I can reach with a drill bit and hog out a lot of that wood. You'll see I'm going to adjust the depth of the drill press table so that I raise and lower it to make room for the head and the drill head, the motor up here on top, as I advance up and down the ramp of the back of this horse head. Again, you'd be amazed. Yeah, you could hold this by hand, and earlier I probably would have done that. But after you hurt yourself a couple of times or have a couple near misses, you find out real quick there's smarter ways of doing this. And that wooden clamp is a great way to do this. Those are super handy. I keep one of those wooden clamps at the drill press all the time. You'll see there's some other clamps and vices down there that I use as well. But that thing is one of the handiest things in the shop. And you can shape those. If you notice there right about where my thumb's at, there's a notch cut out. That notch is on both jaws of that clamp. That way I can grab a round stock. It's great to have these wooden clamps because then you can go in there and customize them. I just buy them at Harbor Freight real cheap. But then I take them back to the shop and cut on them any way I want to make a custom clamp when I need one. I should show you how to make that wooden mallet one day. That was a fun project. I made a round one for my son not long ago. He's getting into woodworking as well. There's angles on that mallet that's actually the angle that you strike it with, which is better than a vertical or a perpendicular mallet face. I tend to like that a whole lot. But the more I use this one, I kind of go, I should have made a round one. So that's what I made for my son, because then you can whack it in any direction. But the round head is also at an angle. So I'll show you that one day. I probably should put another clamp on my wooden clamp so it doesn't keep walking across the table. But there wasn't a lot to do here, and I wasn't in a rush, but I was just saving myself a little time. In fact, I probably didn't save any time by the time I kept repositioning it, There's nothing fancy about this. We're not trying to get real smooth sidewalls. You'll notice I don't take a big chisel and really clean up the edge very much. You can see right there, I'm just kind of scraping away some of the side stuff that was left by the drill bit. But this is not fine joinery at all. It's going to get stuffed with the glue and a bunch of cotton. So nobody's ever going to see that. Nobody's going to see the joint edge. You'll see how the cotton hair folds over this in a minute. And covers all that up. So we're just making the working gauge. I think the depth on that is at least 1.5 inches. An inch and a half everywhere, a little deeper in some places, but we shove the hair down in there about 1.5 inches, you'll see in a minute, with some glue. I'm looking it over, seeing what else I want to shape, so I pulled out a spoke shave. Now, again, I was over there using 80 grit sandpaper a minute ago on that big belt sander. The spoke shaves are going to do a much smoother job. I switched to a different spoke shave just for a little different angle to get into the curves a little better. That blue one is, I think, a record spoke shave. You can find those in a lot of antique shops. The wooden one I made, I don't know if that was a Lee Valley, but that's a kit you can buy. I've got a couple of those that I made. Now here we're going to watch this. See how I got in between there? This is a round rasp I'm using. And I'm dividing the nostrils. That's a little detail, and I kind of go side to side with it, kind of like you're flossing your teeth. But look at that, what that definition does. It doesn't take much, and all of a sudden your eye sees the horse head. While it's not real anatomically correct, there's enough detail there that your eye goes, it's instantly recognizes it as a horse. By the way, once I got done with this, my daughter, of course, my 2-year-old granddaughter, I made this thing way too big. It's big enough for an adult to ride, practically, which is something my wife kids me about all the time. I always make everything big. But the other thing was, it turned out so beautiful. My daughter has her play with it on occasion, but she made this a wall hanger. So it's a really nice decoration in my granddaughter's bedroom. It's kind of an heirloom piece, is the way my daughter describes it, just because the walnut was so pretty. But excuse my back. This is a one-man shop and a one-man camera crew, so I'm doing it all myself, and I'll try to make sure the video here is as clean as possible. So again, go back in there and kind of work it over. You can see we're really starting to define the snout, and by rounding off those, the underside of those, the chin, the cheek areas there, it just gets rid of that flat profile a little bit and makes it look a little better. And you'll see that once we put the finish on it, that jumps out even more. One of the funnest things to do is when you use real wood. Now, this is the difference of using a walnut versus staining a piece of pine, for example. Pine does never can absorb the stain. There's so much resin in it that the stain sits on top. You can paint pine, but don't try to stain it. There's other woods that now, maple, for example, alder. There's a lot of other woods that don't have so much resin content and they will absorb stain. But the problem with stain is it takes, in my experience, it almost always knocks the grain out. I've had beautiful, beautiful wood with gorgeous grain patterns running through it, and then I stained it, and the grain almost disappeared. Now you can see the grain now, but wait until we put the tung oil on this and watch how that grain is going to pop out. Again, I use that white pencil, which is going to sand off very easy in the next step. So it's easy to clean that up. Random orbital sander, so now we're going to do the fine sanding. And I know I should have a dust mask on. I'm doing a 220 sandpaper, and then I think I go to a 320. But that's a very coarse cutting. It's a very high quality sanding disc. I get those from, I think, Klingspor. I should put a link down in there for you sometime. They cut fast, they stay clean, they don't gum up as easy as others. But more important, I've got a Festool vacuum on this, and the Festool vacuum really does a great job of sucking up all that dust. At the time I'm posting this, there's nothing sponsored here. I've been doing this for 15, 20 years. All these tools, again, are kind of project paid for, meaning I don't really pay these things out of pocket. I do it with projects that I get paid for. And that next one buys another tool, gets rid of the tax man. But it also has helped me step up to some pretty cool tools over the years. So we'll see some of that in the future. Kind of going in and just softening all the edges. Again, little boys are going to play with this, so we don't want their fingers to get splinters. So working that over so it's very smooth everywhere you touch it. I might be touching it up just a little bit more, but you see there we got a pretty good head. It's pretty good size too. It's about the size of a pony. It's not real small, but it's beautiful. It came out great. And the reins, when you see it, when my granddaughter holds the reins, it's balanced and it sits real well. Now we're going to do the eyeball now. We're going to figure out where to put the eye in just a minute. You saw me pointing there. Run the dowel up in there. Yep, I like the length of the dowel. We're going to flop the hair on there. Cut. This is just a dollar store cotton mop head, cheapest thing you can get. I'm going to cut it apart so I can get all that nice cotton. You could use other things, but the cotton feel, I didn't do anything to the cotton. I didn't treat it in any way. And it just gives this gorgeous tactile feel to this thing when you pick it up. You just want to hold it and touch it because of the wood is done with tung oil, which leaves it kind of soft and smooth, and then the cotton, and it's just a great toy. You'd be surprised how many adults pick it up. So I'm looking at eyeballs, and if you look at that piece of paper there, I penciled out about 20 different eyeball profiles first. This is a one-time show, so once you do this, you only got one shot at it. Again, I'm using a felt carpenter's marker here, which means this is a one-time shot. That marker ink is going down into the wood, and if I had to sand that out, it'd be a real booger. I'd have to go down in there a 30-second or more to get that ink out. So I drew this quite a few times on paper before I even tried to put it on the wood. I'm going to outline it, kind of work on the shape, and then we'll fill it in. And I kind of overthink all this stuff over and over, but I'm kind of drawing an eyeball in there just to see if the round eye actually kind of looks right in that. But I'm just going to black it out. We're going to keep this, what you might call an abstract. Okay, if you're an abstract painter, you realize that you can give the suggestion of a shape, and the brain turns it into the actual object without you having to put all the detail into it. And so that's what's going to happen here. We're going to put the silhouette of an eyeball, but I'm not going to try to put a shiny, reflective part of the eyeball in. Now you could do all that, of course, but this is actually a very simple way to do it, very elegant, and makes it look nice. So I am, no pun intended, eyeballing the next eyeball, putting my forefinger and my thumb opposite on either side of the wood, and it tells me where to put the next eye. So we're about to get to my favorite part of every job. Now, this is one of the best things about using the actual wood. If you use mahogany and walnut, cherry, when you put the finish on, look how that grain pops out. This wood just turns into magic, and even a plain Jane ugly piece of wood that's sitting in your shop, you put a little bit of oil on it, varnish on it, and look how that color just jumps out. And tung oil is applied just the way it says on the bottle there. It's going to actually be a blend of tung oil and some varnishes usually. It's not 100% tung oil. It is food safe, so that's nice, especially for kids' toys. Tung oil is a great finish. You'll need to put 2 or 3 coats on it. Let it soak in the way it says, wipe it off, give it a few minutes, depending on temperature, and rub some more back in. You let it soak again in between, and then rub it back off. Set that off to the side, and then we're going to soften up the dowel. Just make sure there's no splinters on that. I tapered the end just a little bit on both ends where it's going to go into the be inserted into the wood. In a minute, you're going to see I'm going to do the round ball, decorative ball right here. I'm shaping to go on the end. That's what's going to drag on the floor. Again, I did it a couple of times just to see how it would fit. I used this in part of the cutoff of the horse head, so you can see that I used some of that to use as this, what we call it, the dragger there at the end of the hobby horse. And I'm giving a rough round shape, and all that does is it's going to save me some time on the lathe. When we get to that lathe, don't laugh. I am terrible at the lathe. I keep trying to teach myself how to use that. In fact, I'm about to join my local club. There's an American Woodworkers Guild that's nationwide. These guys are great, and they produce some fantastic stuff. More importantly, they meet up, I think, at least once a month in somebody's shop around town in most major cities. And you can sit there and learn from these guys all day. So I keep telling myself I'm going to have these guys teach me how to use a lathe. That lathe is nothing fancy. I got it at a yard sale. Paid $100 for it, I think, which is a steal these days. But it's just a Harbor Freight guy. Central Machinery, I think, is the brand. So there's nothing fancy. You'll see it stops. It's got next to no juice in it. Very low horsepower. It shakes and rattles, which is the worst thing you can do on a lathe. Come back here, give it a second coat. So in between, I'm going to go step back and forth between the lathe and this horse head and keep applying that tongue finish. The temperature I was doing, pretty warm here in El Paso, even in whenever it was, maybe November, I was making this, and we're dry always. That I wanted to only give it about 15 minutes between coats. The other thing about tung oil, and not everybody would agree with this maybe, but it's pretty forgiving. This is going to leave a satin finish, a low gloss sheen, very little shine. Even though it's shiny now, as it dries, it kind of flattens out a little bit. The more you put on, the more glossy it'll become. A lot of time you can start with tung oil and gradually mix layers until the last layer. In other words, I'll put some tung oil in a cup and put a little varnish in it and gradually reduce the tung oil and gradually end up with all varnish in the end. If you do that 6 or 7 times, you'll come up with a super beautiful, deep shine, depending on what varnish you use. If you use a shiny coat, and you can build up a finish that way. But tung oil itself, by itself, leaves a satin finish, which means if you notice, I kind of dropped that on the workbench a few times. I'm not too worried about a little bit of dust getting into it because it's a wipe on finish and wipe off, and I'm always wiping off that dust again. And the satin eliminates a lot of that problem. You don't have to worry about a super high shine. I am not showing you all of my lathe time just because it's boring. But I'm just kind of doing a fun shape. There's nothing drawn out. I just got in here and made kind of a couple bulbs out of it. You'll see I did the kind of center cut out in the middle and rounded off the front and the back. I'm going to drill it in a minute on the drill press. This is the cheater's way. If I knew how to use a lathe, most guys would come up here with a skilled hand and they would just do this with no need to sand practically. But if you use a random orbital sander and spin it kind of on a medium speed, it does a pretty good job of sanding it smooth and making up for all the mistakes I make on the lathe. So I'm going to take this off in a minute and just hold it in my hand and kind of finish it off. I'm kind of getting in the edges and doing what I can with this. And it's decent. It's usable. it's a kid's toy, and this is the piece that's going to get beat to death, right? I can't wait till my grandson gets a hold of one of these. He's going to tear this thing up. Um, so this is not a fine piece. The walnut's fairly hard. If they go dragging this across the concrete sidewalk, they're going to tear it up a little bit, but that's just character, right? So we're okay with that. I suppose you could use a rubber ball at the end or something like that instead, and that would be more durable. Or just leave it a rounded off stick, just round off the dowel and don't put anything on the end. But in this case, it's a little more decorative and kind of finishes the piece off, balances a little bit visually. Here I'm getting it rounded off. I've got that side I'm holding up, facing me, facing you right now is going to be where we drill it. And so again, watch, I'm going to put that in that wooden block. Now here's where I've got those, if you saw, I should show you, but I've got some cutouts in that block that help me grab round material. And so again, I'm holding the clamp and doing this with the same 3/4 inch. The fine, the smooth, high quality Forester bit, which cuts a flat hole too, by the way, which is nice. So it cuts a nice clean edge on the edges and then a flat hole for that dowel to set in. We're doing the glue up. By the way, I didn't show you, but I already put a little tung oil on that ball. In a minute, we're going to wipe everything down with a few more coats of oil, tung oil. It's oil, but it's actually a varnish oil blend is what's in the shops. And that's what you want. It's a great material. They're not cheating you by mixing it with varnish and not giving you all tung oil. It's just commonly what we call it. Using a little brush in there to get in there, make sure the glue's well distributed, give it a few taps. With a dead blow mallet, I love these dead blows. They're soft on the wood. There's a bunch of, I don't know if they're beads of some sort in there, lead beads or who knows what they are. Probably not. EPA doesn't use lead anymore, let us you do that. But that means the mallet doesn't bounce. And so it hits and stays on there, kind of sends the energy directly into the material you're whacking on. So they're a lot better to work with. Keeping everything wiped down. I probably gave this a couple of coats at least everywhere. The head got probably 3 or 4 coats. You see it already looks pretty flat there, which is I'm going to leave it like that. I'm not going to get it to a high shine. Again, it's a toy, so it's going to get beat up. You make it look too good, they'll never get to play with it. Mom will put it away, and she won't let them play at all with it. You did notice, though, that I drew the eyeball on before I put the tung oil on, and that kind of seals that. That way I'm not drawing on top of it. Had I put the ink on top of the tung oil, it wouldn't have penetrated as well. So here I spread out the fibers. You can see I started to pack some in. Nothing too fancy to show here, except that you can see I just coated the tips with glue really well, about an inch of glue on the ends, the first inch of cotton. And then I just found a scrap stick and jammed it down in there. I jammed it down and I packed it forward so that the fiber is packing against itself as well as getting packed down into the notch. This thing's 2 years old now. I did this back in a couple years back. Actually, it's almost 3 years ago now, and it's held up extremely well. None of those fibers have been pulled out, even though I got a 2-year-old grandson now, and my granddaughter is 5. She was 2 at the time I gave this to her, and he hasn't even managed to yank any of those hairs out, even though I think he uses those hairs half the time and not the rain that we use. So it's held up really well. Spreading these out. I think I flip it over, just make sure the stuff's fairly soaked with glue, not crazy. Look at the blue painter's tape. That saves you a whole lot of hassle. Put tape down first, and that way when we get all done, I'm just going to peel that tape up. There's practically no glue cleanup at all. Remember that notch is about 1.5 inches deep, and I only put about 1 inch of glue on in general. And that means while there's a little bit of glue visible, sometimes at the edge of some of that cotton, for the most part, you'll notice when I pull that off, there's no glue visible at all. The glue's down into the notch, and the cotton is held down by the ends, the roots, not so much up here by the edge. So it just gives it a real clean finish. Flop it all over, pull the tape off from the other side. And that's about it. Give that thing a little bit of time to set up. That's kind of the finished product before I tied on the reins. Don't laugh at my tack job. I'm not a horseman, but that's what we did with the rein, and I hope you like it. Go make yourself one.